The boot caught her in the ribs before she could turn around. She went sideways. Her knees struck the stone plaza, and the flowers she had been holding scattered across the ground in small bursts of color. The young cadet who had kicked her laughed, and so did the two standing behind him. One of them told her to move along, that her presence was embarrassing the square. Another said old women who talked to covered monuments were not right in the head and probably never had been. The old woman pressed herself upright without making a sound. There was blood on her chin from where her face had clipped the edge of the stone, and she wiped it with the back of her hand and looked up at the thing behind her. The monument was enormous. It rose from a wide platform at the center of the square, wrapped in gray cloth from base to crown, every outline obscured. It had been covered like that for decades, by official order of the city council. Some of the younger cadets in the crowd had never seen what was beneath it. Most of them did not think to wonder. The city had told them the covering was protective, that the statue was being restored, that the work was ongoing. The city had been saying that for 60 years. Nobody in the square moved to help her. A few people turned to look. They registered an old woman bleeding on the pavement, decided it was a private matter, and walked on. Her name was Lena. She had been one of the original 6 heroes. In the years before these cadets' parents were born, she had held a healing station at the edge of the Battle of Dawn and kept 600 wounded soldiers alive across 4 straight days without sleep, without reinforcement, without any reason to believe there would be a tomorrow. She had walked out of that battle carrying a name that should have been spoken in every settlement on the continent. The cadets did not know her name. The city had made sure of that, because to remember Lena was to remember the others, and to remember the others was to remember him. Under the gray cloth, arms raised in an ancient fighting stance, carved from stone by the hands of people who had witnessed the impossible, Aang, the king, humanity's greatest commander, stood veiled in the square of the city he had died to protect. His legacy was a footnote. His monuments were hidden. His name, where it still appeared in old texts, came attached to words like reckless and miscalculated and the tragedy of the final battle. The people who had replaced him in power needed him to be a failure. They had worked very hard to make him one. The old woman gathered her scattered flowers from the pavement. She arranged them at the base of the monument's platform with careful hands. Then she sat down beside them, because her ribs were cracked and she could not yet stand, and she waited in the quiet way of someone who had learned to outlast everything. That was the world Aang woke up into. He had no memory of being reborn. One moment there was the crushing dark of the Battle of Dawn, the feeling of something immense tearing through him, the distant sound of his own army still fighting without him. Then there was ceiling. A cracked ceiling above a narrow cot in a barracks room that smelled of old canvas and institutional soap. He lay there for a long time before he moved. His hands were smaller than he remembered. His arms did not respond with the easy power he had spent a lifetime building. When he sat up, his back complained. He was in the body of a recruit, a young man, apparently, who had not been eating well and had done even less exercise. The file on the bunkside table said his name was Aang, which meant whoever had pulled him into this new life had kept something. The file also said he had registered for the Helios City Military Academy and was expected at baseline assessment the following morning. He read the file twice. Then he lay back down and counted 60 years in his head, 60 years of history he had missed, 60 years of change, decay, and replacement, and thought about what he was going to have to do to fix it. He was not surprised that they had rewritten him. He had known powerful men long enough to know what powerful men did when the truth was inconvenient. He was not angry about the statue. He was not even angry about Lena, though he would be. There was a particular kind of anger that only arrived after understanding, and he had only just woken up. He went to sleep, ate the barracks breakfast, and showed up to assessment. The physical trials ran across 2 days. Aang failed most of them. His new body had the cardiovascular capacity of someone who had spent his recent months in exactly the kind of sedentary misery the file's notes implied, which meant the endurance tests left him winded before the benchmarks, and the strength trials put him below the median for his age group by a margin that made the evaluators exchange glances. He heard one of them write the word provisional on a marking board and circle it. He noted this with the detached interest of someone managing a supply chain problem. The body was the problem. The timeline for fixing it was a separate matter. He had worked from worse starting positions. On the afternoon of the second day, the synchronization test came. The device stood in the center of the hall, a column of gray metal, covered in sensor panels, designed to measure how completely a cadet's core energy integrated with a grafted elemental sample. 30% synchronization was the standard for first-year assignment. 52% was the highest score in the current cohort. The senior examiner had stopped paying close attention to individual results by the time Aang stepped forward. He placed his hands on the panels. The readout above the column lit up. 10%. The cadets nearby murmured, not unkindly, just as people murmur when a number confirms what they already expected. The examiner began writing. Aang breathed, and underneath the surface of a body that did not know what it was carrying, something very old pressed lightly against its walls. The number moved. It passed 30. The examiner looked up, past 50, and the senior examiner crossed the hall in 8 brisk steps, certain the machine was malfunctioning. Past 70, past 80, and the column's sensor housing cracked down its center with a sound like dropped ceramic. The readout went dark. Sparks fell from the casing and sizzled on the stone floor. In the silence that followed, the senior examiner stood before the ruined device for a long time. He looked at Aang. He looked at the panels, which were still faintly warm to the touch. He picked up his marking board and wrote 10%, the figure from before the spike, because 10% was something he could file. 80% was something that would require explanations he did not have words for. Aang stepped back from the wreckage. He flexed his fingers once, slowly. The power he had spent a lifetime building was still there, coiled somewhere beneath layers of borrowed flesh and borrowed history. Dormant. Patient, waiting for the right conditions to surface. He had found it once before. He would find it again. He was officially a provisional cadet with a 10% sync score. He decided this was acceptable. Squad assignments came the following morning, posted on a board outside the assignment hall. Aang read the 3 names beneath his own and recognized none of them. The Academy's placement system had matched him with a green core attribute warrior, a yellow core defensive specialist, and a blue core scout, a combination that suggested whoever had written the algorithm was not entirely without imagination. The green core warrior arrived at their meeting room first, which Aang found significant. Her name was Situ Liu. She had finished 2nd overall in the sync trials, and she moved with the particular economy of someone who knew her own capabilities clearly and spent no effort managing other people's impressions of them. She set her mission file on the table, read Aang's provisional notation on the shared assignment sheet, and told him she hoped he would not slow the squad down. Aang told her he would do his best to keep up. Lan arrived next. He was large in the way that certain people are simply large, without effort or self-consciousness about it, yellow core marks worn comfortably on his forearms, carrying a canteen he immediately offered to Aang before the introductions were finished. He said he was glad to be placed with a squad that had varied attributes. He meant it. There was a quality to Lan that Aang recognized from old campaigns, the kind of person who decided on their loyalties early and then stopped reconsidering them. In a long war, that kind of person was worth more than a dozen skilled fighters who thought too much about which side was winning. Suju arrived last. She was slightly out of breath, carrying a small recording device. She pointed at each of them in turn, clicking a button and then reviewing the result with the studious expression of someone cataloging specimens. She said she was a blue core scout and that she liked to document notable situations. She considered this situation notable. She also considered Aang's provisional score notable. She documented both. The 4 of them stood in a room that smelled of chalk dust and damp concrete, and none of them knew yet what they were going to become. Aang looked at them. A skeptic with a 2nd-place sync score. A wall made of a person. An archivist in boots. He had once commanded forces that numbered in the tens of thousands, had coordinated battle lines stretching across 3 separate fog fronts simultaneously. He had never had a squad this small. Something in his chest settled, unexpectedly, like a door finding its frame. He picked up his mission file and told them they should get familiar with the A-rank board before the afternoon briefing. Liu looked at him as though he had said something marginally more interesting than expected. The first real test came a week into their assignment cycle. The Academy sent provisional squads into the fog band outside Helios for reconnaissance exercises. Officially a learning environment, practically a filter. The dispel stels at the perimeter were aging. Their inscriptions had faded across decades of minimal maintenance, and their fields flickered at the corridor's outer edge where the miasma pressed in. Aang noted this without comment. The city's neglect of its own defenses was a longer conversation for another time. They were 40 minutes into the fog when the one-finned demon came down from above. It chose its angle well, dropping from the gray above the corridor, aimed at Suju's back while she scouted ahead of the group. Lu moved at once, her green core armor fragmenting forward into a partial barrier. Lan stepped left to widen the angle of cover. Aang stepped directly into the demon's path. What he did next did not have a name in the Academy's curriculum. It was older than the Academy, older than Helios City, older than everything in this timeline that had grown up over the ruins of the world he had fought for. He went very still, and in that stillness something enormous in him surfaced just far enough to reach through the borrowed body's fear and act. The demon struck the ground 2 meters short of its target. It did not rise. Aang stood over it, breathing steadily. His hand was extended but not visibly doing anything. Lu looked at him. Lan looked at him. Suju took a photograph. The demon's body began dissolving at the edges in the way of things that had spent their power and had none left to hold themselves together. It left behind a small dark core, a first-tier fragment, barely useful, the rough equivalent of a lit match compared to the fires Aang had once commanded. He picked it up, he pressed it to his wrist and absorbed it, and the sensation was sharp and cold in his chest, a new element claiming a small corner of space inside him. Deep inside him, the Crimson King shifted. Just barely, just enough to notice. Aang pocketed what remained and told the squad to keep moving. They did. Suju, walking behind him, wrote something in the margin of her mission log. He did not ask what. The weeks that followed had a rhythm to them. A-rank missions, the kind normally issued to second-year cadets, cleared in sequences that looked efficient from the outside and felt, to Aang, like running training exercises with a recruit's platoon. He positioned, assessed, finished. Lu began predicting his decisions 2 beats before he made them and adjusting her position accordingly. Lan functioned as a mobile anchor, holding whatever ground he was given until told otherwise. Suju accumulated footage and filed it under categories only she understood. Their point total climbed. This made the Black Gun Squad uncomfortable. They held the top position in the rookie standings and had held it for 3 consecutive periods. Their leader was a cadet named Riku who used a red core rifle and had a great deal of energy for expressing his opinions about other squads' qualifications. He expressed those opinions loudly in the mission hall one morning, with an audience, directing them primarily at the concept of a provisional 10% cadet contaminating the upper bracket of the rankings. Lu heard this from across the room. She looked at Aang without saying anything. Aang walked to the mission desk and registered them for a formal point duel with Black Gun Squad. The duel lasted less than 2 minutes. Riku fired first. Aang moved inside the angle of the shot, a technique from a tactical framework 6 decades obsolete, designed originally to counter the siege artillery of a different era, and disarmed him cleanly before the second round could cycle. Riku hit the ground, pinned, while the count of 10 ran out over his squad standing motionless behind Lu's raised hand, and a look that suggested involvement would cost them more points than they were willing to risk. They did not get involved. Riku lost his wagered points. He climbed to his feet without help, looked at his wrists, looked at Aang, and walked off. His squad followed. Aang watched them go and felt nothing in particular about it, because he had made enemies of proud men in every decade of his previous life and had learned that their pride never shortened. It just redirected. Commander Ji Yaotong had been running assessments at Helios for 11 years. She had a good sense of when a cadet's numbers did not match their behavior. Aang's numbers were poor. His mission record was the best in the cohort. The discrepancy had been on her board for 2 weeks before she requested a private sparring session. The arrangement was unofficial. No score, no record, just the 2 of them in the secondary training hall at the end of an afternoon. Ji was a 6-finned yellow core warrior, which put her far above what a registered 10% provisional should have been able to engage. She attacked cleanly, with the controlled force of someone who had learned long ago that display was inefficiency. Aang did not match her strength. His body could not match her strength. He matched her timing instead. Each of her strikes landed in space he had already left. Each of his counters arrived at space she had not yet moved into. It was the combat language of someone who had spent decades learning that raw power was the second tool you reached for, not the first. She called a stop after 12 minutes. She stood with her hands at her sides for a long time. Then she asked where he had learned the footwork pattern he was using, because the last formal record of that style was in pre-defog tactical manuals that had not been in active circulation since before he was born. He told her he had read widely. She did not believe him. She could see that she was not supposed to believe him, that he had offered the answer as a courtesy rather than a truth. She wrote in her notes that Cadet Aang demonstrated tactical intuition inconsistent with his registered metrics, and she recommended continued observation. She dismissed him. He walked out. She stayed in the hall a while longer, standing in the silence left by that sparring session, reading something in the shape of it that did not fit any category she had a form for. Outside, the fog pressed against the city walls. Somewhere beneath the gray cloth in the city center, a stone king waited with his arms raised and no one but an old woman bringing flowers. The world Aang had died for did not know yet that he was back. The boot caught her in the ribs before she could turn around. She went sideways. Her knees struck the stone plaza, and the flowers she had been holding scattered across the ground in small bursts of color. The young cadet who had kicked her laughed, and so did the two standing behind him. One of them told her to move along, that her presence was embarrassing the square. Another said old women who talked to covered monuments were not right in the head and probably never had been. The old woman pressed herself upright without making a sound. There was blood on her chin from where her face had clipped the edge of the stone, and she wiped it with the back of her hand and looked up at the thing behind her. The monument was enormous. It rose from a wide platform at the center of the square, wrapped in gray cloth from base to crown, every outline obscured. It had been covered like that for decades, by official order of the city council. Some of the younger cadets in the crowd had never seen what was beneath it. Most of them did not think to wonder. The city had told them the covering was protective, that the statue was being restored, that the work was ongoing. The city had been saying that for 60 years. Nobody in the square moved to help her. A few people turned to look. They decided it was a private matter and walked on. Her name was Lena. She had been one of the original 6 heroes. In the years before these cadets' parents were born, she had held a healing station at the edge of the Battle of Dawn and kept 600 wounded soldiers alive across 4 straight days without sleep, without reinforcement, without any reason to believe there would be a tomorrow. She had walked out of that battle carrying a name that should have been spoken in every settlement on the continent. The cadets did not know her name. The city had made sure of that, because to remember Lena was to remember the others, and to remember the others was to remember him. Under the gray cloth, arms raised in an ancient fighting stance, carved from stone by people who had witnessed the impossible, Aang, the king, humanity's greatest commander, stood veiled in the square of the city he had died to protect. His legacy was a footnote. His monuments were hidden. His name, where it still appeared in old texts, came attached to words like reckless and miscalculated and the tragedy of the final battle. The people who had replaced him in power needed him to be a failure. They had worked very hard to make him one. The old woman gathered her scattered flowers from the pavement. She arranged them at the base of the monument's platform with careful hands. Then she sat down beside them, because her ribs were cracked and she could not yet stand, and she waited in the quiet way of someone who had learned to outlast everything. That was the world Aang woke up into. He had no memory of being reborn. One moment there was the crushing dark of the Battle of Dawn, the feeling of something immense tearing through him, the distant sound of his own army still fighting without him. Then there was ceiling, a cracked ceiling above a narrow cot in a barracks room that smelled of old canvas and institutional soap. He lay there for a long time before he moved. His hands were smaller than he remembered. When he sat up, his back complained. He was in the body of a recruit, a young man, apparently, who had not been eating well and had done even less exercise. The file on the bunkside table said his name was Aang, which meant whoever had pulled him into this new life had kept something. The file also said he had registered for the Helios City Military Academy and was expected at baseline assessment the following morning. He read the file twice. Then he lay back down and counted 60 years of history he had missed, and thought about what he was going to have to do to fix it. He was not surprised they had rewritten him. He had known powerful men long enough to know what powerful men did when the truth was inconvenient. There was a particular kind of anger that only arrived after understanding, and he had only just woken up. He ate the barracks breakfast and showed up to assessment. The physical trials ran across 2 days. Aang failed most of them. His new body had the cardiovascular capacity of someone who had spent recent months in exactly the kind of sedentary misery the file's notes implied, which meant the endurance tests left him winded before the benchmarks and the strength trials put him below the median for his age group, by a margin that made evaluators exchange glances. He heard one of them write the word provisional on a marking board and circle it. He noted this with the detached interest of someone managing a supply chain problem. The body was the problem. The timeline for fixing it was a separate matter. He had worked from worse starting positions. On the afternoon of the second day, the synchronization test came. The device stood in the center of the hall, a column of gray metal covered in sensor panels, designed to measure how completely a cadet's core energy integrated with a grafted elemental sample. 30% synchronization was the standard for first-year assignment. 52% was the highest score in the current cohort. The senior examiner had stopped paying close attention to individual results by the time Aang stepped forward. He placed his hands on the panels. The readout above the column lit up. 10%. The cadets nearby murmured, not unkindly, just as people murmur when a number confirms what they already expected. The examiner began writing. Aang breathed, and underneath the surface of a body that did not know what it was carrying, something very old pressed lightly against its walls. The number moved. It passed 30. The examiner looked up, past 50, and the senior examiner crossed the hall in 8 brisk steps, certain the machine was malfunctioning. Past 70, past 80, and the column's sensor housing cracked down its center, with a sound like dropped ceramic. The readout went dark. Sparks fell from the casing. In the silence that followed, the senior examiner stood before the ruined device for a long time. He wrote 10% in his report, the figure from before the spike, because 10% was something he could file. 80% was something that would require explanations he did not have words for. Aang stepped back from the wreckage and flexed his fingers once, slowly. The power he had spent a lifetime building was still there, buried under someone else's flesh and someone else's history. Dormant, patient, waiting for fuel. He had found it once before. He would find it again. He was officially a provisional cadet with a 10% sync score. He decided this was acceptable. Squad assignments came the following morning. Aang read the 3 names beneath his own and recognized none of them. The Academy's placement system had matched him with a green core attribute warrior, a yellow core defensive specialist, and a blue core scout. The green core warrior arrived at their meeting room first. Her name was Situ Liu. She had finished second overall in the sync trials, and she moved with the economy of someone who knew her own capabilities clearly and spent no energy managing other people's impressions of them. She read Aang's provisional notation on the shared assignment sheet and told him she hoped he would not slow the squad down. Aang told her he would do his best to keep up. Lan arrived next. He was large without effort or self-consciousness about it, yellow core marks worn comfortably on his forearms, carrying a canteen he immediately offered to Aang before introductions were finished. He said he was glad to be placed with a squad that had varied attributes. He meant it. There was a quality to Lan that Aang recognized from old campaigns, the kind of person who decided on their loyalties early and then stopped reconsidering them. Suju arrived last, slightly out of breath, carrying a small recording device. She pointed at each of them in turn. She said she was a blue core scout and that she liked to document notable situations. She considered this situation notable. She took a photograph of the mission board and filed it under something only she understood. The 4 of them stood in a room that smelled of chalk dust and damp concrete, and none of them knew yet what they were going to become. Aang looked at the 3 of them and felt something unfamiliar move through him. He had commanded armies. He had never had a squad this small. Something in his chest settled, unexpectedly, like a door finding its frame. He picked up his mission file and told them they should get familiar with the A-rank board before the afternoon briefing. The first real test came a week into their assignment cycle. Provisional squads went into the fog band outside Helios for reconnaissance exercises. Officially a learning environment, practically a filter. The dispel stells at the perimeter were aging, their inscriptions faded, their fields flickering at the corridor's outer edge. Aang noted this without comment. They were 40 minutes into the fog when the one-finned demon came from above. It chose its angle well, dropping toward Suju's back while she scouted ahead. Lu moved at once, her green core armor fragmenting forward into a partial barrier. Lan stepped left to widen the angle of cover. Aang stepped directly into the demon's path. What he did next did not have a name in the Academy's curriculum. It was older than the Academy, older than Helios City, older than everything in this timeline that had grown up over the ruins of what he had fought for. He went very still, and in that stillness, something enormous in him surfaced just far enough to reach through the borrowed body's fear and act. The demon struck the ground 2 meters short of its target. It did not rise. The creature's body began dissolving at the edges, leaving behind a small dark core, a first-tier fragment, barely useful. Aang picked it up, pressed it to his wrist and absorbed it, and the sensation was sharp and cold in his chest. Deep inside him, the Crimson King shifted, just barely, just enough to notice. Aang told the squad to keep moving. Suju wrote something in the margin of her mission log. He did not ask what. The weeks that followed had a rhythm to them. A-rank missions cleared in sequences that looked efficient from the outside and felt, to Aang, like training exercises with a recruit's platoon. Lu began predicting his decisions 2 beats before he made them. Lan held whatever ground he was given without being asked twice. Suju accumulated footage and filed it under categories only she understood. Their point total climbed. This made the Black Gun Squad uncomfortable. Their leader was a cadet named Riku who used a red core rifle and had a great deal of energy for expressing opinions about other squads' qualifications. He expressed those opinions loudly in the mission hall one morning, with an audience, directing them at the concept of a provisional 10% cadet contaminating the upper bracket of the rankings. Lu heard this from across the room. She looked at Aang without saying anything. Aang walked to the mission desk and registered them for a formal point duel with Black Gun Squad. The duel lasted less than 2 minutes. Riku fired first. Aang moved inside the angle of the shot, a technique from a tactical framework 60 years obsolete, designed originally for siege artillery, and disarmed him cleanly before the second round could cycle. Riku hit the ground, pinned, while the count of 10 ran out over his squad standing motionless. Lu had raised one hand in their direction with a look that suggested involvement would cost them more points than they were willing to risk. They did not get involved. Riku climbed to his feet without help, looked at his wrists, looked at Aang, and walked away. Aang watched him go and felt nothing in particular about it. He had made enemies of proud men in every decade of his previous life. Their pride never shortened. It just redirected. Commander Ji Yaotong had been evaluating cadets at Helios for 11 years and had a precise sense of when a cadet's numbers did not match their behavior. Aang's numbers were poor. His mission record was the best in the cohort. The discrepancy had been on her board for 2 weeks before she requested a sparring session. Ji was a 6-finned yellow core warrior, far above what a registered 10% provisional should have been able to engage. She attacked cleanly, with the controlled force of someone who had learned long ago that display was inefficiency. Aang did not match her strength. His body could not match her strength. He matched her timing instead. Each of her strikes landed in space he had already left. Each of his counters arrived at space she had not yet filled. It was the combat language of someone who had spent decades learning that raw power was the second tool you reached for, not the first. She called a stop after 12 minutes. She asked where he had learned the footwork pattern he was using, because its last formal record was in pre-defog tactical manuals no longer in active circulation. He told her he had read widely. She did not believe him, and he could see that she was not supposed to believe him. She wrote in her evaluation notes that this provisional cadet demonstrated tactical intuition inconsistent with registered metrics, and she recommended continued observation. She dismissed him. He walked out. She stayed in the hall a while longer, standing in the silence that session had left behind, reading something in the shape of it that she had no form for. Outside, the fog pressed against the city walls. Somewhere beneath the gray cloth in the city center, a stone king waited with his arms raised, and no one but an old woman bringing flowers. The world Aang had died for did not know yet that he was back. They shipped out for the tournament at the end of the 3rd month. The squad rode with a transport convoy from Helios, 20 cadets plus equipment, a route through the Class B hub of Salamanca, and then northeast toward the fog corridor that led to Dawn City. Aang had designed the original road network that made this route possible, in another life, for other reasons, and the experience of riding through it as a passenger was quietly strange. The convoy stopped outside Picadia on the 2nd day. Picadia had once been a Class A settlement, Ranked, fortified, a military installation marking the boundary of the safest transit corridor between the southern settlements and Dawn City. It did not look like that now. The outer walls stood, but their upper sections had been eaten into irregular shapes by years of unchecked miasmic contact. The inner districts were dark. A single emergency beacon pulsed from somewhere near the old garrison, the slow red rhythm of something that had been flashing for a long time without anyone coming. The convoy commander called a halt. The transit protocols for a compromised Class A zone required either a cleared alternative route or a sealed tunnel passage through the city's underground infrastructure. The alternative route was a 3-day detour. The underground passage was available, but the upper entry point sat inside what the sensors read as active demon territory. Someone had to secure the tunnel head first. The squad leaders looked at each other. Then they looked at the provisional cadet with the 10% sync score, because nobody else was available and provisional cadets were technically expendable in emergency assessments. Aang told the convoy commander he would handle it. Liu moved to follow him. He asked her to stay with the convoy. She told him she was his squad and that was not a decision he made unilaterally. Her expression made clear she considered the argument already settled. He asked Lan to hold the convoy's left flank while they were inside, and to trust nobody who came from the wrong direction. Lan said he understood, with the quality of someone for whom understanding an instruction and following it through were the same thing. Aang and Lu entered the tunnel. The tunnel was intact, which was the important thing. Aang had over-engineered every passage he ever designed, a habit from campaigns where a surviving route versus a collapsed one was measured in armies. The corridor ran 400 meters, lit at intervals by emergency panels whose batteries had been running uninterrupted for however long Pakadia had been dark. 200 meters in, the heat reached them through the walls. The demon dropped through a ceiling panel 40 meters ahead, and the space between them and it turned orange. A two-finned fire demon, larger and faster than the fog corridor creature, hot enough to begin heating the air in the enclosed space simply by existing in it. Lu started to raise her barrier. Aang stepped forward and told her to hold her position. The demon came at them fast. He read its approach the way he had read cavalry charges in his previous life. Not the thing itself, but the shape of its momentum, where it would be in 2 seconds rather than where it was now. He moved at the right angle, let it overcommit, and got inside the radius of its fire envelope. At close range, fire demons were slower than at distance. He had known this for 60 years. What followed was not clean. The demon was strong, and Aang's body was still catching up to the demands he placed on it. A hit drove him into the tunnel wall hard enough to crack the ancient stone behind his shoulder. He registered the impact in his left arm. He did not stop. He was operating on tactical memory more than physical capacity, and tactical memory was the one resource his new body had not needed to rebuild from scratch. When the demon finally went still, Aang was breathing hard in a tunnel 10 degrees warmer than it should have been. He absorbed its core before the body finished dissolving, and this absorption was entirely different from the first. The fire element entered him like something that had been waiting for a door, hot and immediately restless, pushing against the other attributes inside him, refusing to settle into a quiet corner. He filed that sensation away for later. Lu looked at his shoulder, at the cracked wall, at the fading remains. She asked if he was capable of continuing. He told her the passage was clear. She said she would assess that answer when they were out of the tunnel. They walked the remaining 200 meters in silence, and at the far end, Aang signaled the convoy through. He did not mention the wall to the convoy commander. He reported the passage secure and rejoined the transport. Suju documented the scorch marks on his jacket and filed them under notable. Dawn City announced itself before it came into view. The fog along the final corridor thinned in a way that felt engineered rather than natural. Dispel spells set at intervals shorter than anything Aang had overseen, their inscriptions fresh enough to suggest recent servicing. Power infrastructure was visible along the route. Relay towers, sensor arrays, the skeletal architecture of a city that had spent 60 years building upward without ever having to rebuild from catastrophe. That was the difference between a city that had survived and one that had been given resources and time to grow, and Dawn City had both. 7 districts, each the size of a small settlement in its own right, arranged around a central administrative tower that rose high enough to disappear into the persistent haze above the fog line. The outer walls were twice the height of Helios's, staffed and lit, covered in relay equipment and weapon emplacements. Even at this distance, the city's noise was audible, the low, layered frequency of a place with several 100,000 people in it, all of them moving. Aang stood at the transport's forward window and looked at the city he had built the foundations of and felt, very precisely, nothing he intended to show anyone. The entry process took most of the morning. The Demon Hunt tournament drew participants from across the settlement hierarchy, which meant Dawn City's entry checkpoints were processing a volume of cadets, weapons, equipment, and credentialing paperwork that the system was only marginally designed to handle. A contact named Paris operated a logistics office near the northern gate, a useful man who had been expecting them and moved their entry credentials through the system with the quiet competence of someone who understood that efficiency was its own currency. They entered the city in the early afternoon. The squad dispersed to the assigned barracks quarter to stow their gear. Aang walked. He told himself he was orienting. That was true enough. He also knew where his feet were taking him. The central square was a 10-minute walk along a processional avenue broad enough to move armies down. It had been designed that way. Aang had walked this street before the stone had been laid, when it was still a planning document. He walked it now as an anonymous cadet from a Class C settlement, wearing a standard-issue jacket with scorch marks on the left shoulder. He turned the corner and saw the covered monument. He stopped. The cloth was gray and meticulously maintained, no weathering, no gaps where the wind had caught it. The city kept it covered and also kept the cover in good repair, which told him something about the kind of effort that had gone into making this a feature of the square that people passed without questioning. He began walking again toward it. Then he saw the woman. She was old. She knelt at the monument's base with a handful of flowers between her hands, her head bowed, with the stillness of someone who had been keeping vigil for a very long time. He registered her slowly, the way you register something your mind knows before your eyes finish the work, the shape of the hands, the angle of the head. He was still processing when the cadet's boot connected with her ribs. She went down. The flowers scattered. The sound of the impact reached him across the square a half-second later, then the laughter, which was somehow worse. 3 cadets, local insignia on their jackets, standing over her with the ease of people who had decided this was allowed. Aang crossed the square. He placed himself between them and the woman on the ground and looked at the nearest cadet for long enough that the laughter dropped away into something uncomfortable. He did not say anything elaborate. He asked them to leave. They looked at him, a single cadet in a plain jacket from somewhere that wasn't Dawn City. The arithmetic appeared straightforward to them. One started to object. Aang took a half-step forward, just a half-step, but the weight behind it was wrong for a 10% provisional nobody, too certain, too settled, and the objection stopped. The 3 of them exchanged a look and walked away. Aang turned. The woman was getting herself upright. Blood ran from her chin where her face had struck the stone. She looked up at him. He looked at her. He had last seen Lena before the final battle, in circumstances that bore no resemblance to this, and the person he was looking at had been changed enormously by time, and by whatever the intervening decades had done to her. But she was still Lena. He recognized her the way you recognize a place from an old story you were told before you could understand it. Not because it looks the same, but because everything that matters does. Her eyes found his face. He watched the recognition arrive in her slowly. The color left her skin. Her hands, which had been gathering the scattered flowers from the stone, went very still. She stared at him. He sat down beside her on the platform step because her ribs were cracked and he did not want her to try to stand. He waited. He had always been good at waiting. She pressed her hand over her mouth. She said nothing for a long time. Eventually she was crying, not loudly, not in collapse, but steadily, the way someone cries who has practiced the discipline of containing grief and found the discipline has limits. It does not announce in advance. He sat with her and did not tell her it would be fine, because he did not know yet whether it would be. The next morning, Aang registered the squad for the Grand Demon Hunt. The tournament structure was straightforward. Teams from across the settlement hierarchy competed in staged clearance operations, eliminating demon threats at escalating difficulty tiers outside the city perimeter. Points accumulated per tier, with multipliers for speed and solo clears. The top-scoring settlement would receive resource priority for the next fiscal cycle. Aang registered their unit as Vanguard, putting them at the front of the clearance formation. Paris facilitated the entry paperwork. The assignment looked like a minor logistical footnote in the tournament records. The Demon Hunt's presiding judges included a member of the new 6 heroes. His name was Van Dillen. He held the Green Core attribute and the Dual Core augmentation that marked the highest tier of human combat designation. He moved through the tournament grounds with the particular ease of someone who had held uncontested authority long enough to have confused it with competence. He was tall, well-decorated, and looked at the assembled participants the way a man looks at scenery. Aang observed him from across the registration ground and noted what the architecture of his posture communicated: supreme confidence, minimal threat awareness, a fighter who had not had a genuine challenge in some time. He also noted that Van Dillen had sent word through an intermediary, with notable condescension, that a Class C Vanguard designation was irregular and would receive no special consideration from the judges. Aang filed this and moved on. The hunt grounds opened the following morning. Aang cleared them efficiently. The structure meant Vanguard teams absorbed first-wave demon contact, while ranked teams followed up the harder encounters. In practice, Aang's squad reached the high-tier zones first and did not leave them for the ranked teams. Liu moved through the mid-tier zone with a precision that had evolved noticeably since the fog corridors outside Helios, reading approach angles now, not just reacting to them. Lan held rear coverage without being asked, processing whatever came from behind the squad with the thoroughness of a structure with no interest in being moved. Suju operated at the extreme forward edge of their formation, fast enough that most demons registered her only after she had already passed. By midday, the Vanguard's point total had passed several ranked teams. By afternoon, it had passed all of them except the Dawn City team operating in a separate zone with home terrain advantage. Van Dillen appeared at the edge of Aang's zone in the early evening. He had a reason on paper, a judge's evaluation of Vanguard performance in unusual high-tier territory. He used that reason to insert himself into the final clearing sequence, and to make clear, through several pointed comments that did not quite qualify as direct interference, that a Class C unit operating above its designated tier might require a committee review. The implication was plain. Aang was being offered a choice between a rigged inspection and a fight. He chose the fight. The demonstration drew a substantial crowd, tournament participants who had noticed the developing situation and drifted toward it with the instinct crowds have for conflict. Van Dillen moved to the center of the evaluation space with genuine unconcern. He was a dual-core 7-finned warrior. A Class C provisional cadet was not a problem to him. It was an illustration. Aang moved opposite him and assessed. A 7-finned dual green core warrior was well beyond what his current body could match in direct power exchange. He read this in the weight of how Van Dillen stood, the pattern of his breathing, the specific way power-dense fighters held themselves slightly apart from the rest of the world. The man was strong. He was also a fighter who had not lost in a long time, and that produced blind spots around the existence of things that could surprise him. Aang planned to operate inside those blind spots. What followed was not a victory. He managed angles, burned energy he could not easily replace, absorbed impacts that would bruise spectacularly by morning. He held Van Dillen to a draw for longer than any logical assessment of their differential should have allowed, and he could feel the precise moment that began to cost him, the point where the physical gap between their bodies stopped being compensable by positioning. Then Lena arrived. She had followed them. Her ribs were still bandaged and she moved carefully, but she placed herself between the two men with the quiet authority of someone who had been doing exactly this kind of thing since before Van Dillen was born. She told the judge, loud enough for the crowd to hear, that the evaluation was complete, that the Vanguard's results stood, and that she would personally witness the scoring documentation. Van Dillen looked at her. Something moved behind his eyes, not hesitation exactly, but the calculation of a man deciding which confrontation cost him more right now. He conceded the evaluation. He turned and walked back toward the tournament officials with the careful composure of someone who had not been stopped but had chosen to stop. Aang stood on the evaluation ground, bruised and winded, and watched him go. He noted the specific quality of the anger in Van Dillen's shoulders. It was not the anger of a man who had accepted a conclusion. It was the anger of a man who had postponed one. That distinction mattered. He kept it. When the tournament scores were tallied that evening, the Vanguard squad's accumulated total gave Pikadia the overall ranking. A ruined city on the edge of the fog, with a provisional squad and a 10% sync cadet, had taken the Grand Demon Hunt. Van Dillen's signature was on the documentation. He had co-signed it himself. Aang met Lena that night at a vantage point she had described in careful, clipped words. An old ledge above the eastern district, accessible before the boundary walls were extended, and still reachable if you knew where the original maintenance ladders had been. He found it without difficulty. He had designed the boundary wall extension. She was already there when he arrived, arms wrapped around herself against the cold, looking out over Dawn City. He sat beside her. Below them, the city ran its usual evening operations. Light, movement, the distant sound of the security shift change at the gate towers. She told him everything. She told him about the weeks after the Battle of Dawn, the council's announcement, the state mourning that transitioned smoothly into a blame narrative, and the careful dismantling of anything that connected the victory to the people who had achieved it. She told him about Desha, his former ally, imprisoned somewhere in the tower complex for reasons the public record described as conduct violations and the actual record never specified. She told him about the new 6 heroes, who held combined military and judicial authority and answered to no one below them. She told him about Van Dillen, his history, his methods, her detailed and unfavorable assessment of his character. She told him about the current king, whose actual appearance and history were controlled information, whose presence was always filtered through intermediaries, who had held that arrangement for as long as anyone in the city could clearly remember. Then she reached into her jacket and held something out to him. It was a small stone object on a cord, old, plain, worn smooth at the edges from decades of handling. He looked at it for a moment. He reached out and took it. He had carved it himself 60 years ago from a piece of chalk stone on the night before the final battle. He had given it to Lena on the understanding, which he had not spoken aloud, but which both of them had known, that he might not come back from what was coming. He had not imagined she would still have it. She was crying again, steady, contained, the way someone cries who has had a great deal of practice keeping it inside, and discovered, twice now in 2 days, that there are limits to containment. He did not offer her comfort he did not yet have the grounds for. He sat with her on the old ledge above the city that bore his name in a hidden file and nowhere else, held the necklace in his hand, and thought about Daisha locked in that tower, and thought about Van Dillen's face when he had been forced to sign the documentation, and thought about what came next. He had a squad. He had absorbed a fire element. He had found one of his surviving allies and learned the full shape of what had been done. The new 6 heroes had an enemy they had not registered yet. They would. After the tournament, Aang pursued a separate thread from the squad's standard rotation. Lena had given him information about elemental integration cores, rare objects found in certain demon layers, capable of forcing multiple elemental attributes into temporary synchronization within a single carrier. A human body running on a standard single-attribute grafting system had no use for them. Aang was not running on a standard system. He was running on absorbed fire and earth and speed traces and the residual signature of the Crimson King, all in an arrangement that had no precedent in the current era's academic literature. The elements were not cooperating. They occupied separate territories inside him and maintained a tense, costly peace, each one's natural instinct working against the others. He needed a way to make them function together. The integration core was the nearest available solution. The location Lena identified was a structure called Dracula's Boneyard Castle, 2 hours outside Dawn City's southern perimeter, in a fog zone classified as restricted access, not by official prohibition, but because the demon population inside it trended toward the 5-finned range, and 5-finned opponents had a way of reducing clearance teams to case study data. He told Liu where he was going. She did not ask his reasons. She said she would be ready at dawn. He noticed she had stopped asking whether she was allowed to come. The castle was what the fog had made of something that might once have been a military outpost. The original architecture buried under decades of demonic modification, internal corridors rerouted to serve spatial priorities with no relation to human inhabitation. They encountered the first 5-finned demon in the outer wing. The gap between a 4-finned and 5-finned opponent was not linear. 5-finned demons operated with enough individual power to negate barriers that would stop anything below them, moved faster than human reflexes at baseline, and coordinated with their environment in ways that suggested genuine tactical thinking rather than predator instinct. This one had 2 companions positioned 40 meters behind it. Liu read the formation at the same moment Aang did. She moved left. pulling the flanking pair with a barrier probe loud enough to demand their attention. Aang took the lead threat at close range, reading the mechanics of its approach rather than its speed, placing himself where the approach had gaps. The fight cost him. His left side registered impacts his body would remember for several days. He absorbed the core when it was done, noted a new element entering his system, and found Lu standing over the two flankers with controlled precision marks on her barrier plates. He told her she had timed the draw well. She told him that was basic formation reading and asked whether he needed his arm examined. He said he was fine. She looked at his left arm with the expression of someone who knew what fine looked like and had concluded it did not apply here. She applied a green core recovery assist to the shoulder joint without further comment and moved on. The integration core sat in the castle's inner sanctum, held inside a containment unit clearly assembled by a human hand. Beside it stood a man named Uther. Uther was a Dawn City noble who had been extracting private resources from restricted access zones for what the quantity of cataloged materials around him suggested was an extended period. He introduced himself with the smooth urgency of someone accustomed to resolving inconvenient situations through social means, mentioned a private survey claim, and suggested 2 cadets from outside the city would want to consider their position carefully. He knew Aang by tournament reputation. He was attempting to use that reputation as leverage, though he was doing it at an angle that allowed him to deny the attempt if challenged. Aang picked up the integration core from the containment unit. He told Uther the survey claim was noted. Uther's expression moved through several configurations before settling on cautious compliance. Aang told him to stay inside the outer perimeter until the exit corridor was clear and to file the demon clearance under his own squad's name if he wished. The attribution was not something Aang required. Uther nodded with the specific quality of someone accepting an arrangement while already deciding how to reframe it later. Aang and Lu walked out. In the transition zone between the fog-heavy interior and the cleaner corridor toward the city road, they found the mercenaries. 6 of them. 6-finned, multi-attribute. Operating with equipment quality from Dawn City's upper contractor tier, which meant someone had commissioned them privately and recently. Behind them, through the castle's outer wall, Uther would have had a clear sight line to the road. Lu assessed the formation. The calculation running in her expression arrived at the same conclusion Aang's had. He told her to run. She said no. He told her that was not a discussion. She told him, with the flatness of someone who had already settled the argument internally, that she made her own decisions. So he did the only thing the situation left available. He pushed his energy output past what his body was designed to sustain. He pulled on every absorbed core simultaneously and stopped letting the elements compete inside him, forcing them to accumulate in the same direction instead, and applied whatever that produced to making the next 40 seconds as catastrophic as possible for 6 opponents at close range. He remembered very little of the actual 40 seconds. When he was aware again, Lu was unhurt. The mercenaries were not functional, and he was face down on the corridor stone with a core system that had communicated its objections thoroughly. Lu pulled him upright. He could stand, which he counted as acceptable. They were half a kilometer from the castle when the air changed. Not the miasma, not the fog's familiar weight, something else. A presence that arrived the way weather arrives. Not moving toward them but simply there, occupying the air's dimensions as though it had rearranged its prior commitments to be in this particular place. The black-finned queen materialized in the corridor ahead of them. She was 8-finned, a ruler of space and time, and she moved through the world as though its physics had reached an accommodation with her long ago and now applied only as courtesy. She looked at Lu with the focused attention of someone who had come specifically to find something and found it. Then she looked at Aang. She communicated, through something that was more impression than language, that the old king's return had been noted, that the body he occupied was insufficient for his intentions, but that was his problem to address. She had not come for him. She turned back to Liu. What followed had no explanation in the Academy's grafting curriculum. The black-finned queen placed one hand against Lu's sternum and transferred something, a condensed spatial awareness that arrived not as an added tool, but as an internalized sense. The beginning of an ability to perceive space itself as a substance that could be shaped and moved, rather than a fixed condition to operate within. Liu's expression during this was the expression of someone discovering a room in a house they had lived in for years. The queen withdrew. She looked at Aang once more. assessing, filing something away. And then she was not in the corridor anymore. The air settled. Liu stood with her hands open, looking at nothing specific. Then she reached to her left, into empty space, and closed her fist. The space where her hand closed compressed inward by a small but visible amount. She opened her fingers and watched it resolve. Aang observed this with the focused attention of a commander assessing new capacity. He said nothing. He picked up the integration core, which he had kept hold of through the entire encounter, and they started walking back toward the city road. They spent the following weeks in Salamanca City, a Class B hub midway between Dawn City and the southern settlements. Substantial arena culture, enough transient population that two outsiders with unusual capabilities could operate without accumulating attention they did not want. Aang needed isolation to work with the integration core. He found a basement training space in the Eastern Merchant District and began. 5 elements inside a single human body was a condition the body found categorically unnatural. Wood, fire, water, metal, earth. Each had its own resonance pattern, its own relationship with the others, its own way of expressing hostility toward elements it had not been designed to coexist with. The integration core provided a catalyst, lowering the energy threshold for elemental contact enough to make interaction possible. The experience of using it ran from sustained discomfort in the first 3 days to real pain in the days after, and by the end of the second week Aang had stopped processing the work in terms of sensation and was thinking about it the way he had thought about long campaigns, as a series of positions that had to be taken in sequence, where the cost of each was known in advance and simply had to be paid. He came up occasionally for food, which he took seriously, because the metabolic cost of forcing elemental integration exceeded anything combat had previously asked of his body. On one of those surface intervals he found Liu. She had been competing in Salamanca's central arena under the name Rakshasa Cat, masked, ranked among the regular combat circuit, which meant she had converted the spatial power into a functional combat tool at a speed that was genuinely impressive. She had also built a following. The crowd called her by the mask name, and did not know yet what she could do. She was holding the spatial manipulation in reserve, but her green core techniques carried enough precision to make the arena's regular participants look as though they were operating on a significant delay. He watched one of her bouts from the upper stands. She finished it cleanly and, leaving the floor, looked up toward the stands with the instinct of someone who recognized the feeling of being observed. She found him across the distance, and held the look for a moment before continuing to the exit. He went back to the basement. The breakthrough arrived at the end of the 3rd week, late in an evening session when he had been working for 8 consecutive hours. He had the 5 elements at the threshold of contact, compressed, the integration core barely maintaining the arrangement. He had been trying to force them into cooperation through directed pressure, the same kind of application he used in combat to override an opponent's pattern. It had not been working. The elements were not opponents. They had their own nature, and pressure that would work on something pushing back achieved nothing against something simply being what it was. He stopped pushing. He let the elements find their own contact points, the way water finds its own level when you stop pouring it into a shape. Wood reached toward water as it always had. Fire reached toward wood. The connections had their own logic, and he stopped interrupting that logic with directives. The result arrived without announcement. The 5 elements, finding their natural junction points, created an interference pattern at every boundary. 5 simultaneous contact zones where opposing attributes met and contested. The energy at those boundaries was not any of the 5 elements. It was something produced by all of them simultaneously. A byproduct of the friction and the contact and the precisely unnatural combination of things that should not have been in the same body at the same time. White-edged, carrying traces of every element it came from. Not a natural phenomenon, but a synthetic one, something produced only by this exact combination, in this exact body, that Aang had never encountered in 60 years of combat. Lightning. He sat with it for a long time, feeling it move through him, understanding what it was. It moved faster than most demons could track. It carried no single elemental signature, which meant defenses calibrated for specific attributes offered it incomplete protection. It converted the inefficiency of 5 competing elements into a unified output. He spent the rest of the night learning how it moved. The Little Bean incident arrived without forewarning, as demon infiltrations tend to. Liu had a bout scheduled in the Salamanca Arena's evening session. Lan and Suju had made their way to the city through a combination of Suju's information network and Lan's absolute refusal to consider the squad a unit with an optional membership. They were in the upper stands when the attack began. Little Bean was a demon with enough intelligence to have acquired a name and enough organizational capacity to have placed contacts inside the arena's gate security. The infiltration came through the ventilation infrastructure, converging from 3 insertion points timed to hit maximum crowd density simultaneously. The demons broke through the lower level first. Crowd panic followed. Lu was on the arena floor when the initial wave came in. She moved toward the crowd's edge rather than the exits, trying to hold the boundary instead of abandoning it, and Aang, watching from a maintenance corridor where he had been observing without announcing himself, read her decision and moved to support it. He came through the far access gate in his new state. The lightning running through him produced a visible effect at this level of activation, white-edged current moving across his skin and flickering at his hands. His silhouette entirely changed from the plain-jacketed cadet who had entered earlier. The demons on the floor oriented toward him the way threats orient toward whatever has declared itself most clearly. Good. That was the purpose. The lightning performed differently than he had anticipated in the confined space. Not worse, but stranger. The speed was accurate. The multi-elemental disruption effect on demon defenses worked as expected. What he had not modeled was the resonance. His synthetic element produced visible distress in affected demons before contact, as though the proximity of something that should not exist was already harmful to what they were made of. He filed this for later and worked through the floor-level threats in sequence while Lu used her spatial compression to contain the engagement zones, keeping the civilians crowded against the outer ring from becoming collateral in the middle of someone else's problem. Little Bean appeared in the upper corridor when the floor force had been reduced by roughly 2/3. It was larger than its subordinates and carried a psychic attribute overlay designed to produce disorientation in single-core humans. It met a mind already managing 5 competing elements simultaneously and found no additional purchase. Aang reached Little Bean in the corridor and gave it approximately the same consideration the fire demon in Picadia's tunnel had received. The infiltration ended. Lu found him in the corridor afterward. She looked at his hands, where the lightning was still settling into dormancy, and then at his face. She said their formation needed updating. He agreed. They returned to Helios 3 weeks later. Commander Ji Yaotong had proposed a direct combat assessment in place of the committee review that Aang's discharge request would normally trigger. 3 senior commanders simultaneously. No injury. Hold position for a 20 count. Whatever happened in the training hall stayed there. No paperwork trail for Dawn City to find inconvenient. It was, Aang recognized, the solution of someone attempting to help him while maintaining the appearance of correct procedure. He appreciated the approach. The assessment took place in the main training hall with Ji and 2 ranking commanders at one end and Aang at the other. Ji came forward with yellow core defensive pressure, force application that occupied space rather than attacking it directly, creating constraints on movement. The second commander hit from the right with blue core speed overlaps. The third drove left with red core impact spikes. He moved through them. The 3 of them had trained together, and their coordination was good, and good coordination had patterns he could read in its first 4 seconds. He did not fight all 3 simultaneously. He fought each of them for approximately 1 second each, cycling through the natural gaps in their timing's rhythm, using the body's mechanics rather than its power, redirecting rather than overpowering, which was the appropriate level for a demonstration that needed to show capability without causing injury. The 20 count passed. All 3 commanders stood. None had significant damage. Ji Yaotong had a pressure mark on her left wrist where he had redirected her final line and was looking at it with the expression of someone adding new data to a calculation that had been running for months. The discharge papers were signed that afternoon. He came out of the administration building and found his squad on the step outside. All of them. Lan with his full kit already packed. Suju with her recording device pointed at the discharge document. Lu standing slightly apart reading something in the middle distance with the focused expression of someone managing several thoughts at once. He told them they did not need to come with him. What he was walking toward was not an academy mission. The risks attached to it were not covered by any assignment protocol, and the enemy at the end of it was not a fog creature with a fin count. These were obligations he had carried for 60 years, personal and not transferable. He said this carefully and completely. Lan said he had already packed, with the tone of someone who considered the discussion concluded. Suju said she was documenting the whole situation and could not document it from Helios. Liu looked at him directly and said nothing at all, which was not ambiguous. He looked at the three of them. He picked up his own kit from the step beside the door and said they should move, because they had a long road and Lena was expecting them. They reached Dawn City 4 days later and met Lena at a safe house near the district boundary, a room above a supply depot operated by a former military contractor who had decided his loyalty to the old order was worth the risk of the new one finding out about it. Lena had been healing slowly. Her ribs had been strapped properly, her core had stabilized, and she moved with the careful precision of someone managing damage but refusing to be managed by it. She had also been gathering information through the network of contacts she had maintained across 60 years of living quietly in a city that had stripped her rank but not her connections. She told Aang that Dylan was aware of their squad's movements, that his informant network extended into the tournament administrative tier, which meant he had access to their movement logs from the demon hunt. She told him that what he was planning, a direct move against the prison complex where Desha was held, would require either a significant diversion or a significantly stronger force than 4 cadets and 1 former hero. She told him she was going to retrieve something first, a personal matter. She did not explain further, and her expression suggested she understood the strategic problem with what she was describing and had decided to proceed anyway. He knew what she was going back for. He had seen his own necklace on her neck again, and knew she had given it back only temporarily, that returning for it was not sentiment, but the act of someone who had carried something for 60 years and was not going to set it down until she chose to. He told her to take Liu. She told him Liu was not required and she would manage the entry herself. Her healer's credentials still held with the lower administrative tiers, and a former hero with legitimate papers made fewer waves than a young woman who had recently held several Dawn City cadets to embarrassing results in public. He told her again to take Liu. She told him she understood. She went alone. Van Dillen ambushed her at the district checkpoint near the memorial quarter. He had been watching the necklace, or watching her, or watching both. The specifics were a question Aang did not have answers to afterward, only the result. He had brought 2 subordinates, and all 7 fins worth of his dual-core capacity, and he used it with the specific cruelty of someone who had decided this confrontation had been earned. When they found Lena, she was alive. Both her arms were gone below the elbow. Her core output had been driven to near depletion, not enough left to trigger her own healing function. Dylan had left her conscious and functional enough to understand what had been done to her. He had been very careful about that. He had also sent a message through back channels that he was available to receive Aang at the outer gate of the Eastern District at a time of his choosing. Lan looked at the message when Aang showed it to him, then he looked at Aang. He did not say anything. He picked up his barrier plates and put them on. They went to the gate. The Crimson King had been patient for months. Aang had held him back with the precise awareness that borrowing the king's power came with costs that compounded, that the body he inhabited was not designed to serve as a vessel for an 8-finned entity, and each incursion left residue that accumulated. He had managed the balance carefully. He stopped managing it at the gate. Dylan appeared at the agreed coordinates with his subordinates, and the particular composure of a man who expected this confrontation to conclude his current problem. He saw Aang. He adjusted his assessment based on whatever he read and how Aang was standing, and began his transformation. The dual-core demonization that converted his already extraordinary capacity into something beyond it. Dimensional constructs taking shape around him. The air inside his zone warping with the spatial distortion that 7-fin demonization produced. Then, the king surfaced. The sensation of the Crimson King commandeering the body was not something Aang could describe accurately afterward. It was not control being taken. It was something deeper than control. The king's awareness overlaying his own, the way a larger instrument overtunes a smaller one in the same space. He was present. He was not directing. The king moved through his hands and his stance and his energy output with the authority of something that had been waiting behind a door that had finally been opened. Dylan's demonization slowed. Then it stopped. Then it reversed. The king did not destroy him cleanly. The king demonstrated something, which was worse, showed Dylan the precise differential between what Dylan was and what stood across from him now, and expressed that differential physically, systematically, in a way that left no interpretive ambiguity. By the time the king receded and Aang's own awareness was fully present again, Dylan was on the ground and Aang's body was failing under the residue of what had just moved through it. The accumulated cost hit all at once. Bones that had been asked to conduct 8-fin energy at 7-fin capacity, expressing what that meant in structural terms. He had one window before his legs stopped working. He reached for the Crimson Tide sword. The sword was the one artifact that had followed him across deaths, not by any mechanism he had designed, but by whatever logic the world applied to objects that had been bound to a particular soul's purpose across multiple lifetimes. It was where it needed to be when he reached for it, and the moment his hands closed around it, the residue energy in his system found a channel that could actually carry it. The lightning and the sword and whatever remained of the king's passing were suddenly working in the same direction. Dylan's final dimensional constructs, enormous serpent forms of warped space he had shaped in the last moments of his demonization, met Aang's counter and fractured. Then Aang hit him. The impact removed the problem of Van Dylan from the world, with a completeness that left no interpretive ambiguity about outcome. Aang claimed the dual 7-fin cores from what remained, because Lena needed them more than Dylan's legacy did, and Lan caught him by the arm as his legs completed the process of expressing their objection to the last several minutes. They delivered the cores to Lena. Liu fused them in, a precise, painstaking transfer that required Liu's spatial ability to manipulate the core's positional integration in real time, and Lena's own dormant healer functioned to receive and convert them rather than reject them. It took 3 hours. Suju documented the entire process from the corner of the room with the recording device and did not say anything until it was done, which was the most respectful thing Aang had ever seen her do. When Lena opened her eyes, her arms had returned. Not quickly, the regeneration moved at the pace of the body understanding new instructions, but completely. She looked at her hands for a long time, then she looked at Aang. She did not say anything. Neither did he. It was enough. They left Dawn City through one of the emergency underground passages Aang had designed 60 years ago, which had been maintained well enough by the geological stability of the terrain that it was still fully navigable. Paris facilitated their exit documentation. They came up into the open fog corridor south of the Eastern District and moved without stopping toward the Class C zone. Oasis Town was a small settlement 2 days out, a minor hub, unaffiliated with the major city hierarchies, the kind of place that existed in the gaps between formal classifications. A former hero named Ran An lived there. He had been Yellow Corps, one of the original 6 heroes, and he had survived the years after the Battle of Dawn by making himself small in a place nobody with authority felt it was worth traveling to. They arrived at nightfall on the second day. Ran An answered the door to a modest house, a family man now, children's belongings visible in the entry hall, one arm gone above the elbow, replaced with a simple mechanical assist that looked like it had been repaired several times. He looked at the group. He looked at Lena. He looked at Aang. His face went through several things rapidly. Then he struck Aang. It was not a combat blow. It was the blow of someone who had spent years accumulating a grief too large for language and had found the appropriate shape for it suddenly standing on his doorstep. He hit Aang with his remaining fist, and the impact was significant because Ran An had been a first-tier warrior and had kept the core of that capacity even with 1 arm and 2 decades of a quiet life. He said things about the weight of what came after, about the years of carrying a story the rest of humanity had been told wrong, about what it cost to survive a battle that your king did not, and then to survive the peace that told you the king had been the problem. Aang stood and let him say it. Then Ran An sat down on the step outside his front door and pressed his hand over his eyes, and the children's voices came faintly from inside the house, and the night around the settlement was quiet. Eventually Ran An stood up. He told them to come inside and eat something, because they looked like people who had been making poor nutritional decisions for several weeks. He was not wrong. Aang told them the truth at Ran An's table, while Lena was helping with the children and Lan was eating with the focused application of someone restoring a structural deficit, and Suju had put the recording device away out of an apparently instinctive sense that this was not an occasion for documentation. He told Liu and Lan and Suju what he was. Not the broad outline they had been piecing together from accumulating evidence, the specific truth, from the beginning, who he had been, what the battle had cost, why he had come back, what he needed to do before the accounting was finished. Suju's expression moved through several configurations and settled on the specific stillness of someone with a great deal to say who had decided this was not the moment. Lan looked at him for a long time. Then he said that he had wondered, once or twice, about the footwork. Lu looked at the table surface. She looked at her own hands. She looked up at Aang, and whatever she was managing internally was visible in her face for a moment before she contained it. Not anger, not disbelief, but the particular expression of someone recalculating a great many things simultaneously and discovering the recalculation produces a coherent result. She said that it explained the tactical manuals. He said it did. Ranan came back into the room and sat down and said he had already known from the moment he opened the door, and that 60 years had been too long to wait for this conversation, and that they should all get some sleep, because whatever was coming next was going to require them to have slept. They had 2 days of that quiet. Ranan's house, the children's noise, Lena's careful recovery, Lan consuming a truly remarkable quantity of food that the household produced without apparent objection. On the 3rd day, the attack came. Leo arrived first. Dual Red Corps, a member of the new 6 heroes, Dylan's fellow and his consequence. He came with a tracked unit, having followed the exit trail from Dawn City through the corridor network with professional thoroughness. Leo did not come alone. Alongside him was a demon he had brought as a contractor, Young Bird, known also as Fledgling, a high-tier illusion demon with a history of cooperation with Dawn City officials and a recently deceased companion that the events at the outer gate had indirectly contributed to. Young Bird's approach was not direct. The domain arrived around Aang's teammates before any of them registered the perimeter shift. One moment, Lan and Suju and Lu were positioned at the settlement's outer ring. Then they were elsewhere, not physically moved but contained, wrapped in an illusionary reality that Young Bird had woven around them with the precision of a trap set before the engagement began. Inside the domain, time moved differently. What would be minutes in the exterior world would register to its occupants as days, and Young Bird had not made the experience comfortable. Aang felt the domain close. He registered his teammates' absence from his perimeter awareness and tracked the mechanism, a pocket reality, internally sealed, maintained by the demon's continuous will. He had one option that did not require getting inside the domain, because getting inside the domain meant becoming subject to it, and becoming subject to it was what Young Bird wanted. He looked up. The sky above Oasis Town had the particular character of fog-cleared altitude. The dispel steels in the settlement's perimeter had pushed the miasma back enough that the upper air was genuine air rather than miasmic residue, and genuine air at altitude carried the potential for genuine weather. He called the lightning storm down, not produced from inside himself, pulled from the atmosphere, from the accumulated electrical potential of the fog-cleared upper zone, channeled through the same synthetic lightning he had built from 5 elements, using the resonance between what was in him and what was above him as a bridge. The storm arrived in a matter of seconds, enormous, loud, the kind of atmospheric event that registered as a geological fact rather than a weather condition. He hit the domain walls with it. The pocket reality was sealed against physical intrusion from the outside. It was not sealed against an energy source that existed simultaneously in multiple elemental categories at once, because its construction had been calibrated for human single-attribute interference thresholds. The lightning was not a human phenomenon. It was the wrong category entirely. The domain walls cracked from the outside inward, and his teammates came back into the world 3 at a time, gasping, bringing with them the residue of whatever Young Bird had been making them experience inside the pocket hours that had felt like days. Suju was bleeding from 2 places on her arms where she had apparently kept swinging at threats that existed only in the domain long after the blood loss should have stopped her. She was still swinging when the domain dissolved. Lan caught her. Young Bird turned from the cracked remnants of the domain and gave Aang its full attention. Aang had been the correct target from the start. Young Bird had known that. The teammates had been the leverage, the insurance, the means of ensuring that what came next happened on Young Bird's terms, rather than the other way around. Young Bird opened the black hole. It was not a spatial phenomenon in the way Lu's new ability manipulated space, not curvature or compression, but a cognitive singularity, a contained reality that operated on the mind rather than the body. Young Bird projected it around Aang's awareness and collapsed the perimeter inward, and the inside of the black hole was not dark. It was everything. It was every direction of time Aang might have gone and did not. Every battle fought and cost and aftermath. Every version of loss rendered with the fidelity of direct experience. He lived through it. All of it. Lifetimes. The demon was patient. The singularity was comprehensive. What Youngbird had not calculated, what the demon had no framework to calculate, was what it meant to put a man who had already died once inside a construct built to make death feel certain. Aang had been on the other side of everything Youngbird was threatening. He had already paid the cost of an actual battle for an actual world, had actually lost, had actually been erased, had actually come back. The simulated certainty of a black hole was a copy of an experience his particular history had made him specific to. At the bottom of the collapsing singularity, where Youngbird had placed what felt like absolute endings, Aang found the lightning. It was still there. The 5 elements were still in him. The synthetic output they produced did not stop being what it was, because someone had wrapped a constructed reality around the mind that contained them. He reactivated the lightning form not with external expression but with internal recognition. This is what I am, regardless of where I appear to be. And the white current moved through his awareness, and through the black hole's internal walls, and through the outside boundary of the domain. And he was standing in Oasis Town again, in the ordinary air, with the ordinary fog at the settlement's perimeter, and Leo's unit at a distance, and his teammates behind him. Youngbird registered the outcome of the black hole with the specific quality of an entity that has placed a certainty and been surprised. It did not have long to process the surprise. Aang moved. Not toward the demon, not with an announced approach, but through the space behind it, through the gap the demon had created in its own attention by focusing on the collapsed domain's failure, and the lightning form carried him there in the space between one of Youngbird's awareness cycles and the next. He drove the Crimson Tide blade through Youngbird from behind. The demon went still. The afternoon was quiet except for the distant sound of Leo's unit reconsidering its advance.